on YouTube and Facebook. We welcome you to the program tonight, talking about the history of the Jeep. It's going to be a great program. We're going to get our music started and let everybody in. Let's do this. Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Greatest Generation Live for Thursday, November 6th. My name is Sean Hall. I'm the Director of Programming with the Veterans Breakfast Club. Great to see you all here this evening on a brisk, cool November night. We're going to be talking about the Jeep tonight. Great subject, very interesting history, even updates as of even November 1st. We have updates on this history. But Glenn being the host tonight. Glenn, how are you doing?
Doing fine. Thank you, Sean. And you? Great.
I'm wonderful, thank you. And yeah, for those of you who may be new to us, we're the Veterans Breakfast Club. Our mission is creating communities of listening around veterans and their stories to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. We've been doing this for 18 years, and we invite you to visit our website, veteransbreakfastclub.org, to find out everything there is to know about us, from our mission to past events to upcoming in-person and online programs. Check out our free quarterly magazine. There's a digital version there on our website, and you can even become a supporting member, which we would greatly appreciate. But without further ado, I'll chime in a little bit later. Glenn, take us away.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, Sean. Pleasure to be on again Thursday night. And I just want to point out there's one reason I love doing this. Last Thursday, we had Paul Tibbets IV on, the grandson of Paul Tibbets Jr., and we spent the evening talking about the atomic bomb and the B-17 and the B-29, then the B-2, and the more current nuclear deterrents. This week, we're going to sort of pivot to the Jeep, which is quite an interesting pivot. It has its own story, just like Paul Tibbets Jr. and Paul Tibbets the fourth have. We often tell stories of veterans, mostly veterans. This is sort of the ultimate mechanical veteran, right? The Jeep. And the neat thing about it, it has some really interesting Pittsburgh ties. For those of you from Pittsburgh, which most of you are from the area, I know, you know about the ties to Pittsburgh. Well, the Pittsburgh area, I should say, really Butler, Pennsylvania. So Butler we include as part of Pittsburgh whenever we kind of want to reach out a little bit, right? So I can say that. I have some cousins that live up that way. So Greatest Generation Live, for those of you not familiar with us, it's all things World War II, and tonight we're covering the Jeep. And we have a very special guest with us, actually two special guests, but let me introduce Paul Bruno. Paul, please wave your hand a bit. Okay. Paul is the author of several books on the Jeep. Paul knows everything there is to ever know about the history of the Jeep for its creation. Paul, the other day, Paul and I were talking, and he said, yeah, my knowledge of the Jeep stops in what, 1942. Is that right, Paul?
Yeah, January 42. That's a boom. Anything after that, bringing someone else on as the guest.
Sort of like my LP collection. It stops in 1975. Hasn't been any music created since 1975 worth listening to. But we also have from the Heinz History Center, Leslie Presbilic. Did I come close to that, Leslie?
Presbilic, but I answered anything that sounds remotely close to that name, so you're good.
Well, I'll remind you, I have a Polish-Croatian wife, and I can't pronounce her maiden name whatsoever. So thank you for being on. Leslie's a curator at the Heinz History Center. She's been on several times before when a topic comes up that kind of fits with Heinz, and we welcome you tonight.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I imagine many of you have been to the Heinz History Center and seen the Bantam Jeep that is there in the main lobby. And Leslie's going to send me some photos of that. Paul's going to be talking about the history of Bantam and the history of the development of the contract with the U.S. Army. And then when we get to the right point, I'll bring in Leslie to show us a few pictures of the Jeep. And Chris Perillo, where are you, Chris? Are you on tonight? There you are, Chris. Let's unmute Chris. There you
Hello,
are,
everybody.
Chris.
Hi.
So I didn't know they had Jeeps in the Navy, Chris.
They had Jeeps everywhere, and I know we're going to get a good lesson on that, but 600,000 were produced and sent to every corner of the world. Remember, we were allies with the Soviet Union. They needed them in Australia, wherever they needed to go. Imagine 600,000 of those vehicles spread around the world during the war.
Yeah. When I think Chris Perello, I think Navy ships, not Jeeps. So I got a great email from Chris earlier today with some other photos of that Jeep down at Heinz History Center. And I think, Chris, you're a docent down there. Is that right?
I am a concierge and a volunteer. I will not claim to be on the level of those wonderful docents who work there,
Okay.
but I am proud to be affiliated with that organization.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for sending. And several other people have sent in emails, some with photos, some with just their own Jeep story. So it's a very popular subject. So let's get started. We'll start with Paul, and let me bring up and share some photos and this PowerPoint that Paul and I had developed over the last couple of days. So we get our normal sort of nice pictorial view of all this. Give me a second here. There we go. So this is a picture that Todd came up with for our email announcement. I'm not sure when you could have bought a Jeep for $795. Certainly not today. More like $79,500 to get one of those beautiful Jeeps that are out there. Um, Paul, when do you know when 795 was the price for a Jeep? I imagine just post-war. Oops, let me unmute you, Paul. There you go.
That's not your fault. I was trying to be polite and I muted myself, not realizing that I would not be able to unmute myself. So 0 for 1. Good start. Yeah, I have no idea when they were $795. That might even be before my time, which I'm not all that young.
So Paul has written, I don't know how many books on the Jeep.
I've written 3 total. One's a case study book in project management on the creation of the first Jeep. The book you see on the screen is my historical book that covers the creation and development of the Jeep right up through January 1942 and those 7 Jeeps that are on the cover. And it's a pretty detailed book. I'll get into that later. And so given that it's so detailed and as much as it pains me, I would say it's not a page turner. It's a historical book, but it's got a lot of interest stuff in it. So I created a picture book that someone can read in an hour with some of the key documents and other photos that people can read in an hour and get a good sense of the story without having to delve into or make the commitment to read that book. Which, if you want to know soup to nuts what happened to creation development Jeep, and I'll tell you why I say that as the program goes on. That's the book to get.
And Paul, tell us a little bit about your background. I know you're not an historian by training. How did you get involved in the history of the Jeep, and how long have you been researching this and pouring your heart into it all?
Yeah, a great question. My background is actually information technology and project management. I did go to school for those particular disciplines, but I also do have an MA in history. Big military history buff and a big history buff. So I kind of married the two of my skill sets with the first book. And so how I got involved with the Jeep story was back in 1999. My wife and I were writing screenplays. And one day I was watching the History Channel back when they had history on the History Channel. And I was watching the big rigs of combat Jeep. And as I told Glenn, it's amazing I've lived this long, living on the edge like that, doing those kind of things. And basically, that right before the commercial, they said the first Jeep was created by a bankrupt car company in Butler, Pennsylvania in 1940. And I'm like, wow, I never knew that. And so I listened afterwards, and they gave a brief history of Bantam and what they had accomplished. And if I knew 25 years later I'd still be talking about it, maybe I wouldn't have watched after the commercial break. But that was the genesis of my journey with the Jeep history. Started in the research to write the screenplay. That was never produced. In 2011, my wife and I decided to tell the story in book form, and here we are.
Well, it's a wonderful, wonderful book and a lot of research. And again, you are Mr. Encyclopedia on the Jeep from my few discussions with you. So let's start this way. When did and who even started thinking about the development of a vehicle like this? I know it was the U.S. Army who started thinking about it, but what brought that on?
Right. And before we get into that for your audience, I want to give them a frame up one thing, which you'll hear me talk about, and that is the Federal Trade Commission court case that happened during the war, where the Federal Trade Commission, if you haven't heard of this, sued Willys-Overland for false advertising that they'd created the Jeep. And in this court case, what happened was they deposed every single person that was important who had done anything in terms of the creation and development of the Jeep. 3,500 pages of testimony, 500 exhibits. And they asked these people, what did you do? When did you do it? How'd you do it? Why did you do it? And this court case was done during the war. Now, as a historian or a historical researcher, you may get oral histories from people, but they may be done many years later. They may be, they may embellish what they say, or they don't remember exactly. This was done, the court case was done only a few years after during the war, a few years after the events. So everybody's memory was really still good. And more importantly, from a research perspective, they're in a court case. They're being deposed, which means they're giving testimony. They would have to tell the truth as they knew it. Otherwise, they could be up for a perjury charge. So that is what makes my book special. That court case was with the FTC for 30 years. It was then transferred to the National Archives in the mid-70s. And for some odd reason or another, no one besides me that I know of I copied thousands and thousands of pages of it, read all of it, and realized it was the holy grail for early Jeep history to tell the story of what happened with the most historical accuracy ever. Why me? I don't know. I'm not all that special. So that's a key thing. And I'll talk about the court case and the testimony and who testified as we're going through the presentation. Now, why to develop a vehicle, to answer Glenn's question? After World War I, there was a peace decade. The Army demobilized. In 1930s, you had the Great Depression. No money was available for the military. But technology was moving forward, and especially in the late 30s, the Germans were really rapidly mobilizing their armed forces. And the United States military knew they had to find a vehicle to replace the horse and mule to move troops and small payloads from the experiences of World War I. And they needed it to be small and lightweight. They needed it to meet the demands of a number of different using arms, including infantry, cavalry, field artillery, ordnance. And during the late 1930s, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, they really couldn't come up with a solution. But that's the problem that they had, is we need this small vehicle to be able to be much more mobile on the battlefield than they obviously were decades before in World War I, and knowing for any future conflict.
So it's actually a pretty good example of some Army forward thinking, which we don't normally associate with the Army, at least of the 1930s.
Yeah, they were trying, the infantry had tried in the late 1930s to find a vehicle. They had found a vehicle they wanted. They went to the quartermaster, and the quartermaster totally botched this is 1939, the procurement, and didn't get the infantry what they wanted. That would actually impact the development of the Jeep the following year, and I'll mention why. So the infantry was really the leading using arm in terms of finding a solution to this mobility problem, and their main desire was as a weapons carrier.
Yeah.
So besides,
I would just remind our audience, this is at a time where the U.S. Army, somewhere in the late 30s, I didn't look up the precise date, 38 or 39, finally disbanded its cavalry divisions. I mean, cavalry divisions with horses. We still had them in the late 30s. So a little hard to believe after the ravages of World War I that you'd still have cavalry divisions in the late 30s, but at least somebody was waking up and realized that it was going to be a mechanized military going forward. Okay. So, and this is the quartermaster corps of the U.S. Army, correct?
Well, the quartermaster wasn't really doing anything. It was the infantry that was really did a lot of research, which I actually put in my book. They came up with a vehicle called the Marmon Harrington 4x4, which was key, was the 4x4. That was the vehicle they wanted. That was the best fit through testing in 38 and 39. And the quartermaster didn't get the job done right. And I'll mention some of the stuff as we go through the story, all these tie-ins between the using arms and conflicts and drama upon drama, where you think like, oh, they just need the vehicle and they have it. Well, if you need lots of drama, come to the creation of the Jeep. We got a story to tell.
So, Paul, how did they come to find this little company up in Butler, Pennsylvania called Bantam?
Exactly. Great. Another just right on, spot on where we need to go. So what happened was Bantam was bankrupt. This is why this makes such a great movie. They were bankrupt. They had no resources. They weren't working. The factory was idle. So in February 1940, they hired a guy named Charles Payne to go to the War Department and try to drum up business, even manufacturing of aircraft parts, because the Air Force was still under the Army in 1940. Didn't become, if my memory is correct, I don't think it became a separate branch around 1947. So they hire this guy, Charles Payne. He goes for months in terms of looking for someone for work for the Bantam factory. Can't find anybody, even though in the back of his mind, he would love to help them develop a small car. Simultaneously, we go to May 1940, and there's a gentleman in the infantry called Ingemar Oseth. He's a colonel working in the War Department in the infantry division. He goes to a place called Camp Holabird, Maryland, which was the depot that they procured many things, but motor vehicles back then in 1940 was outside of Baltimore, Maryland. Okay, Camp Holabird plays a big part in the creation of the Jeep. He goes up to a 3-day conference there, and all they talk about is vehicles and also this small vehicle. And at the end of that conference on May 21st, they wrap up the conference with, we don't have a vehicle that fits what we need. We don't have any plans to procure a vehicle, and we have no plans to make plans to procure a vehicle. Oseth goes back to his office and literally, and this is the stuff, this came out in the testimony. He's talking about this in his testimony from the court case. Sitting in the window behind his desk is Charles Payne from Bantam. And Payne says to him, looking for Robert Howie, who had created a contraption called the Howie machine gun carrier, and I want to see if I can interest someone in the infantry in a small vehicle. And Oseth says to him, Howie's not your guy, I'm your guy, because Oseth had been at Fort Benning when they had done the testing to come up with the Marmon Harrington. So this completely serendipitous meeting on May 21st is how the Jeep procurement, as I call it, the creation of the Jeep started. And it doesn't take me long, less than 5 minutes to go. You can't make that up. The guy's sitting at the window behind the guy's desk. Hey, I'm here. We need a vehicle. So that was the beginning of the Jeep story. And I'll let you ask the question, or I can continue on what happened next.
Well, I guess what happens next is they come up to Butler and meet Bantam. Is that right?
Close. What happened was Oseth and Payne worked together to create a general characteristics memo. Okay. And they work together, and that memo, they get it through all the approvals, and it comes out from the infantry on June 6, 1940. And that 4 years to the day before D-Day. Can't make that up. And that memo is the first document that launches the actual official procurement. And when I was doing my research, I found that document. I could find no documents before that in terms of the creation of what they called the truck quarter-ton 4x4 light. The reason was, once I understood from the court case, that started everything, the June 6th memo. And now, in that June 6th memo, Oseth testifies in the court case. I love this. He's in a room with a bunch of lawyers, and he says, I basically put into that a memo, an armored face shield for the driver, although the thing was only supposed to weigh 1,000 pounds. And the reason he said I put that in there, he called it a lawyer's trick, i.e., I'm being deceptive. Infantry was so mad at the quartermaster for botching that procurement I talked about in 1939. He didn't want the quartermaster to be able to have anything to do with this vehicle. Anything that had armor in it went to the ordnance department. Now, the ordnance that goes over to the ordnance department gets filed through channels, and the ordnance department had a meeting, and they all looked around. Everybody can have been in one of these meetings in your career, in your life. They're looking around going, we have absolutely no clue how to procure a vehicle because that's not what we do. We blow stuff up. The quartermaster should be doing this. So how about we go to Butler and we'll meet with the Bantam people and see if we can figure out what's going on with this vehicle. So that's how they end up in Butler on June 19th and 20th, 1940, to continue on the development of this vehicle, trying to get more information and ideas of what this vehicle could possibly be. So, and go ahead, Glenn. I'm sorry.
So I just brought up these photos you had sent me of some of the principals at American Bantam Car Company. We just call it Bantam for short. And without identifying every one of these, who are a couple of the key people that we should take note of here?
Carl Probst was key. Well, Frank Fenn on the left was key. He provided the executive leadership. Carl Probst, I can do it pretty quickly, Glenn. The guy, okay, the second guy that's leaning against the tire there, right there, he was the design engineer they hired to help them develop the first Jeep. Roy Evans, that's sitting in the car, he was the CEO of the company to the left. He's in the passenger seat in that car. There, he was the guy that kept Bantam alive and was the overall owner. Harold Christ in the driver's seat in the next picture was their plant manager. Over one, that guy right there. He was absolutely the key guy. That guy was an automotive genius. The guy in the bottom left, that's a guy named Chester Hempfling. He's literally holding the tin snips that he used to cut the rounded hood on the first Jeep. And that was him later in life. He actually kept those. And the final gentleman is a gentleman by the name of Ralph Turner Sr., and he was a mechanic and a hands-on automotive guy that worked on the creation of the first Jeep. Those 6 people are the key players in terms of the development of the Bantam Jeep.
So when is it when the quartermaster guys, right? When is it when they come up to Butler and meet the Bantam team?
Yeah, the quartermaster would get involved just a little bit, even though there was a quartermaster representative. They went up there on June 19th and 20th, 1940. They had extensive discussions. Frank Fenn, the guy on the left, he testified in the court case in detail exactly what happened on those 2 days. 3 pages of testimony. They arrived, we did this, we did this, we did this, we did this. Never before published that I know of in terms of exactly what happened there. Now,
and the outcome of that meeting was what? This sketch that we're going to show next?
Yeah, 2 things. I'll go over one first. A key piece of what they were looking for was 4x4. They would need to work with a company called Spicer Axle out of Toledo, of all things, which was literally down the street from Willis. And we'll talk about the axle and later on when they're building the Jeep. The other was they came up with a concept drawing of what they thought the Jeep would look like and be like. And that's the actual drawing. It's a copy that was put into the court case in 1945. Its exhibit number is 169. And I actually held that in my hand. And I would see this before I went into the court case online, and they would say, we believe this is the first drawing of anything that would become a Jeep, but we don't know who drew it, where they drew it, why they drew in the context. Well, I'm reading Frank Fenn's testimony at page 2,950. And he literally told the story, said at the end of the first day, Mr. Brown and Mr. Beasley took out a yellow scratch pad indicating, so he's pointing to a yellow legal pad in the courtroom, and said they made a drawing of what they thought the vehicle would be like and look like. And that's that drawing. So now we know who drew it, where they drew it, why they drew it, and what the purpose of it was. Literally, that was buried for 80 years or 70 years till I stumbled upon it in the testimony on the court case, where that drawing fits in the story of the creation of the Jeep. Every Jeep that anyone has ever seen comes from that drawing, which just blows my mind. Holding that in my hand, it's like so historic. It's just amazing. So you could see that they came up with a pretty good concept of what it would be in those couple of days.
So this is a result of the Army engineers and the team at Bantam, talking this through. And
couldn't say it better myself. Absolutely.
And then what happens next?
What happens next is the ordnance department goes back. They have another meeting, and they basically, the higher ups got involved in the Army and said, yeah, no, there's no armored face shield on this, and it's a vehicle. It needs to be procured by the quartermaster. So by the end of June, lawyers Oseth trick, they were transferred over to the quartermaster on June 27th, 1940. That had failed. So Oseth and the infantry were going to have to work with the quartermaster, if they like it or not, which was actually the absolute correct decision. So what happened was, once it was transferred to the quartermaster, they got to work, and they were working at warp speed. And in 3 weeks, they developed a specification called ES475 and a concept drawing called 08370-Z that they could send to manufacturers to build a vehicle from. 3 weeks. And in the testimony in the court case, Colonel Oseth and some others described in detail how they came about in terms of getting that specification in this drawing, which Glenn has brought up on the screen, how it came about. They did a wood mock-up on the floor. They did a chalk outline. A chalk outline on the floor. They did a wooden mock-up, and so on and so forth. So this drawing here that Glenn is showing you, that is the next step from that concept drawing, and you can see them really getting the sense of a vehicle in terms of what it would look like. Now, if Glenn can point it out, if you see on the driver's side, you see how it kind of curves in an S right there perfectly, right there. I want to just make a note of that because you're going to see that again. All right. So if you want to bring the other one up, Glenn, the bigger picture, I think the one before this. Yeah. So there's the whole drawing. I mean, the level of his history of this, again, from the concept drawing, then this drawing, every Jeep ever made comes from this drawing. And just be able to hold that in my hand and be able to make a copy of it. It was in the court case as an exhibit, is really amazing. So
ground zero for the Jeep.
Ground zero, well said. Ground zero for the Jeep. You're looking at it. Everyone's looking at it. It's just amazing.
And so now Bantam has these drawings, and do they then go about trying to develop a prototype?
Oh, Glenn, that would be too easy. I mean, come on, we got to make this hard. So they get everything finalized in early July 1940, and Bantam, going to your point, Glenn, thinks they're going to get a negotiated contract, and they're just going to be able to build the Jeep. And the quartermaster says, nah, we're not going to do that. We're going to send this out to 135 companies and ask them to bid on this, right? And they were only anticipating a few people to bid. Well, that particular development caught Bantam totally by surprise. And if anybody remembers, Bantam is bankrupt. They don't have anybody, right? So they reach out to the aforementioned Carl Probst. He's living in Detroit, right? And he's a well-known design engineer. This is a very small community. They kind of all know each other in Detroit, Toledo, over there in Butler in the Northeast, or in the Midwest and Northeast. And Probst tells Frank Fenn, the other gentleman whose picture you saw, he goes, yeah, no, I'm not coming. I got to pay my bills. I'm not going to go to Butler and work for free and basically try to help you win this bid. And if you don't win the bid, I don't get any money. Well, a name that you're going to hear again later that got back to a gentleman by name William Knudsen, who had been a former GM executive, and Franklin Roosevelt, I believe himself, had asked to come in and head up a new agency called the War Production Office to help them. They were already realized they were going to have to build up toward a war. So to help coordinate that, Bill Knudsen called up Carl Probst and said, this procurement is really important to the Army. You need to go to Butler. And Probst is relating this 22 years later. He says, I couldn't say no to Mr. Knudsen. So time to jump in my car, stop off at Spicer Axle, and end up in Butler on about July 18th, 1940, with the bid packages due on July 22nd, 1940. So he arrives on a Thursday, and they're like, due the next Monday. He spends almost 48 hours straight drawing up Bantam's bid package and everything else, so they could be prepared to go to Camp Holabird to submit their bid package. So again, you talk about, you can't make that up. It's like, we don't have anybody. Probst is not going to come. He comes, and in 3 days, they put together this whole bid package with a drawing and fill out all the forms that need to be filled out. It was called ES 475, as I mentioned, and fill that all out. So here's what we're going to bid in terms of building this vehicle. Amazing stuff. It's like, wow.
And how many companies, made the bid?
Right. So what happened was it would eventually be 4 people at the bid opening, but because they needed more drama, Glenn, so Bantam drives down Frank Fenn and Probst and Harold Christ, the guy who was driving the BRC. They drive down to Baltimore the night before, the Sunday night before they're going to put their bid in, right? I love this story. Charles Payne, he was an operator. He was an interesting individual. Well, I mentioned the weight before. The original weight plan was 1,000 pounds, okay? Because they thought it would replace the motorcycle with sidecar, weighed 1,000 pounds. But nobody in the Army asked anyone that actually had to build this thing if it could weigh 1,000 pounds. There was no way it was going to weigh 1,000 pounds, all right? They had upped it to 1,300 pounds by the time the bids were sent out. Still couldn't do it. Well, Carl Probst, he's an honest engineer. He had put in their bid form 1,800 pounds. Payne is reviewing that. Now, anybody that's up for government procurement may enjoy this story. Payne looks at that and blows a gasket and says, you can't say it's going to weigh 1,800 pounds. They will reject us immediately. Now, Carl Probst is relating this story 22 years later to his son, and it ended up in a journal that I found. He said they called in a stenographer and retyped the whole bid package overnight and put in the weight 1,273 pounds. He's now relating this 22 years later. Now, they barely got the forms done to arrive at 10 o'clock at Camp Holabird. Now, where Paul Bruno comes into this story is, I'm looking in the court case. In the court case, they have Bantam's actual bid proposal. The actual documents dated July 20th, 1940, the American Bantam Car Company. So I'm sitting in the archives, and I said, is this really Bantam's bid proposal? This is like massively historic. And I opened it up, and I had known that story from Carl Probst. I looked at the weight box, 1,273 pounds. He'd remembered exactly what they put in. So because Bantam needed, Frank Fenn needed more stress in his life, so they barely get to time to put their bid in at Camp Holabird at 10 a.m. on, I think it was Monday, July 22nd, 1940. And to answer your question, only 4 out of the 135, only 4 people showed up. A company named Crosley, who declined to bid, and Ford declined to bid because the Army said in another one of they had really thought about it, really decided, based upon everything that was possible. Well, yeah, we want you to build the prototype in 49 days. Not. They just made that up out of the thin air. So you had 2 requirements, the weight and the 49-day bid, a 49-day build time, which literally everyone felt 49 days was impossible. They would have to build the vehicle. Yeah. And one of the people that thought it was impossible was the other person that was at the company that was at the bid. So Ford said, we can't build this in 75 days, 49 days, not going to happen. Willys-Overland, who we will be talking about a lot as part of this journey, they came and they basically objected to the weight. because they said there's no way you could build this for 1,300 pounds and the time frame. So they said they could deliver it in 75 days. Bantam, and this is one of those great, people can decide what they do or not. They're bankrupt. They're lying about the weight. They know they can't build it for 1,273 pounds. And they also said, yeah, we could build this in 49 days. They had absolutely no idea if they could build it in 49 days. But they're like, that's what the Army wants. Sounds good to us. So they take the bids. The guy, Herbert Law, Colonel Law, or he was actually a major at the time, comes back out again, drama. This Major Laws knew Bantam needed this. So I think he was literally pulling on their chain. He comes out and says, Willis has the low bid. And the Bantam people are like, we're done. We're bankrupt. We're not gonna happen. Then he says, but Willis says they can't build it till 75 days. And with penalty, Bantam has the low bid. So Bantam's going to get the contract. It's like, oh my God, you can't make that up. It's like, so Willis is honest and they got penalized for being honest.
Yeah, as you say, in the procurement process, not just for the government, but for a lot of procurement processes, honesty does not always win the day. And there's a bankrupt company desperate to try to stay alive, saying whatever it has to say to get a contract. So jump to the point that they get the contract to build the prototype.
They get the contract, comes through. They have 49 days, takes a little while. So the 49-day clock starts on August 5th. And there's the key issue is, can Spicer, who I mentioned earlier, deliver the axle? Now, what was great is I went to the archives and I said, boy, it'd be nice to find out something about how the axle was developed, right? Just need to ask, Glenn. I'm reading through the trial transcripts, and they deposed gentlemen by name of Fred Hall and Robert Lewis, who were the engineers who designed the axles for Spicer for the Bantam prototype and the Willis prototype. And they had written out a whole testimony that they read into the record of what they did, when they did it, and how they did it to develop the most critical component for the early Jeeps and for Jeeps in general. I'm like, you can't find this anywhere. I'm like, oh my God. So they had that. So that had to come in. And the other thing that I found, which won't bore people with how they, built the Jeep, was Bantam knew they were working on something special. They took pictures while they're developing the Jeep. And I met a guy in Butler, he's since passed away, Robert Brandon, great guy. He was kind enough to loan me those photographs so I could clue them in the book in terms of watching Bantam build the Jeep. They literally would put calendar, paper calendar dates next to the part and what date it was. Like the body, it says September 4th, 1940. So they did their thing. Spicer delivered the axle around September 15th. They able to put it all together and literally completed it on September 21st, 1940, 2 days before it's going to be delivered. And if Glenn, the man himself, that is Bantam's original Jeep, Bantam #1, the very first Jeep created. And 10 minutes after they created it, they rolled it out and someone said, get a Kodak, and they took a picture of it. If you can see the right arm underneath the passenger side guy, notice how that matches exactly up that curvature that they created there to the concept drawing we showed earlier, that rounded, part there. Yeah. So that's amazing. So that's, exactly, they built it to the concept drawing, and, they had to put all their engineering into it. And these guys basically manufactured parts by hand and then drew the blueprints. They used a lot of off-the-shelf parts, and it was just a mad scramble for 49 days for them to try to create this amazing new vehicle from what they had to work with, and they did it. An amazing team.
But it's recognizable as a Jeep. What did they call it at that time?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for reminding me. So they roll it out, and they had, they're literally standing there in this picture, and they go, what are we going to call this thing? And so right there, they christened it the Bantam Reconnaissance Car, which actually goes toward the cavalry use that they would have as a reconnaissance. They had that on their mind. And so that's why the early Bantam Jeeps are called the BRC, Bantam Reconnaissance Car. So that's how they got the name for that.
And let me ask, see now, Leslie, the car the Jeep that you have in the Heinz History Center, Is that a BRC? Is that a subsequent model? Whoops, that's on mute. Let me unmute you.
I got it. From what I know, the Smithsonian does call it a Bantam reconnaissance vehicle, but I don't have the records to know if they specifically call it a BRC. There's a story behind how they acquired it. They realized after the fact they had an earlier exhibit and they had shown what was one of the early prototypes, and then by the time they decided to try and actually collect a vehicle, it was a little bit later, and there was a mad scramble across the country before someone found one that they felt met their specifications. So,
okay,
I might be able to shed a little light on that, Glenn, if you'd like.
sure, go right ahead. Let me see if I can bring up the picture that Chris and Leslie sent me. So go ahead and talk, and I'll fuss with the background.
Feel free to fact check me if I get anything that is incorrect.
You are clearly the Jeep expert, not me.
Right. Well, I appreciate that. My understanding of it is that is a Bantam reconnaissance car, that one there. And if he brings it up, you'll see the rounded hood. All right. So the one that he just showed on September 21st, 1940, that was BRC number 1. And Leslie, we talked before the show.
It is supposedly, they called it number 1007, meaning it was the 7th out of 62, I think, that were 62. Yeah, the 7th out of 62.
Right. That was the Gramps. The one we showed on September 21st is number 1. Gramps is number 7. And their nomenclature for it is they called it a BRC 60. I cannot find why they called it a 60. So, and you'll see the rounded hood if Glenn's able to bring that up. And that was the original contract, which I failed to mention, was they were going to build a prototype and 69 more. So when Leslie says they built 62, she's absolutely correct. They built 62 of one version and 7 more of another. And if you see that rounded hood, that's actually a lineage from a Bantam Roadster. And you're only going to see this rounded hood on the Bantam prototype, these 62 that Leslie's talking about, and the Willys Quad, which we'll talk about later. Ford came up with the idea of having a flat grille. So that is literally the 7th one they built after the other one we showed earlier that they rolled out on September 21st, 1940. That is a massively historic Jeep.
And I'll say the Smithsonian, it turned out they were really lucky to get that, because ironically, I mean, I think one of the things that stands out to me as someone who works with acquiring the historic physical materials is that they had hosted, and technically it was the U.S. National Museum at the time, as early as 1941, they kind of realized there was something interesting here, and they'd hosted an exhibit about some of the prototypes and the new developments related to fighting a potential war. And after that, they borrowed something, they returned it, and it was in 44 that they realized, oh my gosh, this was such an amazing thing, we need it. And they went back out. That Jeep you see there was added to the Smithsonian's collection in 1944, which is incredibly early for a historical organization like that to truly kind of say and confirm, wow, this is something so important, it matters now. But it was a mad scramble to go and find one, because of course at that point Bantam was no longer in the picture, and the ones that they had made had been scattered. So it's very, very fortunate that it ended up in their collection. As I said, it's been on display at the History Center since 2002. I will mention too, on another floor of the building, there is an early example of one of those little Bantam Roadsters, the little cars. And it's really interesting. If you just looked at that and you didn't know the history of what we now consider the Jeep, it looks almost like a toy vehicle. It's so small, but it fits with the history of Bantam again perfectly.
And Leslie, you mentioned you sent me this picture.
Yeah, I was thinking, like everybody else, when you reached out to me, Glenn, I had the idea, the loss of the fire in Butler on my mind, and this is actually a photo from when the History Center featured Gramps, among some other things, in our major exhibit about World War II, really the home front World War II, back in 2015. And I liked the juxtaposition. Here is Gramps. Here's that great, you've heard the dramatic story, one of many, regarding the photo that's behind it. And then if you see to the left, that actually, and I saw someone in the messages asked about the trailers. We borrowed one of the Bantam trailers. They got that little consolation prize of, here, you can do a trailer. You don't get the big contract. And then behind that is one of the great, we have a ton of photos. Talk about this amazing Western Pennsylvania legacy from Westinghouse and Bantam to Dervaux. That's one of the great images of Dervaux's yard and the production of the LSTs, and just the legacy of the region, and not just volume of what is done, but these innovations and these developments that really changed the course of the war. It really is a remarkable story, and Bantam is one of the most dramatic parts of it. And you're telling it very well. I have to say, you're capturing all the drama wonderfully.
Well, just remind Leslie too, the other great story we had last time, I think you were on with us, Leslie, was about the Heinz
doing glider, companies like that doing glider wings. And of course, Westinghouse, you mentioned Tibbets and the Bomb, and Westinghouse, especially in Forest Hills and East Pittsburgh. And now, I mean, they're working all over the country, but from their early work with atomic things to the radar developments, I mean, just a remarkable legacy. And you know, I was reflecting on that as I heard the news about the fire in Butler. And it's what makes some of these stories and preserving the impact of the World War II home front so difficult. In this case, we're fortunate that the Jeep as a vehicle is this thing that people can wrap themselves around, and its legacy has continued, because it's really difficult to preserve those buildings and those large industrial complexes. So,
yeah. And Western Pennsylvania is just full of those 100 and 150-year-old industrial complexes. And I've marched through many of them in my banking career. But okay. Well, Leslie, thank you for popping in. And please feel free to raise your hand or wave your hand and if you have a thought or comment as we continue with Paul. So, Paul, let's continue the story. So at this point, the prototype car is out. Bantam should be, no pun intended, in the driver's seat to get this contract. It's going to save the company. They're going to make the Jeep. What happens? Why don't they get the contract?
Well,
The
Glenn,
big contract.
and Leslie, definitely jump in, Leslie, anytime. We need more drama. That's what we need. So what happened was, Bantam delivers their vehicle. We're going to step back and match up the next part of the story, and that's Willys-Overland. So Willys-Overland did not get the contract to build the first 70. So the quartermaster decides, without going into all the detail, you know what, Willis, they called him in and said, if you want to develop a prototype on your own money and submit it with no guarantee that we would even, that it would go anywhere, feel free to do so. Okay. And there's some key people that will mention. I think Delmar Rouge should literally be a living legend in terms of the Jeep story. And I'll talk about him in a bit. And then Joseph Frazier, it was the president. So, but Delmar Rouge was the vice president of engineering. It was his genius with a small team like Bantam, but his genius that went in developing the three Willys vehicles, their prototype, the quad, their experimental model, the MA, and then eventually the Jeep for the war, the MB. Delmar Rouge is an amazing story. So the quartermaster says, Willis, you can build a vehicle at your own expense. Willis takes up the challenge without, to keep things, short. The key thing from Willis, they build their vehicle over the summer, and they decide, that Delmar Rouge decides, we're going to use a Willys engine called the Go Devil engine, and it was 60 horsepower. Bantam had used a 40 horsepower engine because of the weight issue. Delmar Rouge said, I know more power in a military vehicle is never wasted, but it would make them really struggle with the weight requirement. Willis built their prototype, delivered it on November 13th, 1945, and there it is, the Willys quad. And Glenn, again, if you can show that side by the steering wheel, you see that curvature there. Okay, again, right out of concept drawing 08370-Z. Perfect, Glenn. I love it. So now you have a second player in the Jeep procurement, Willys, to bring in the third player, Ford. The quartermaster decides, and there's a picture of the quad being tested at Holabird in December of 1940, being driven around by some brass. The quartermaster decides, you know what, we want Ford in this. So they call Ford up. They didn't even, and said in early October 1940, and said, we'd like you to build the vehicle. And Ford says, all right, why not? So they give them all the documentation and everything that had been created up to that point, and Ford's able to build the vehicle between October 4th, 1940 and November 23rd. They delivered their vehicle. They called theirs the Ford Pygmy. Its official designation was GP for government, a government vehicle or procurement, and P for a vehicle with an 80-inch wheelbase. And there's the Ford Pygmy at Camp Holabird, Maryland, around December 1940 being tested. And you notice now they had the flat grille. So the quad had the rounded hood, and the early Bantams. But now, and the Army would decide the flat grill or hood, or actually grill, would be the standard. But so now you have three players by November 1940 in the mix, trying to create this new vehicle, three different concepts in terms of what this vehicle be like. So again, it's not been called really a Jeep yet. It's the BRC, the Willys Quad, and the Ford Pygmy, or the Ford GP #1. So there we are at in late 1940, and then it gets even more interesting. Okay, so we'll talk about the Willys MA here. So if Glenn asked me, all right, it's kind of just what happened next. So after Bantam's Jeep turned out to be a massive triumph that literally they delivered, we stopped at September 21st. They took a day to test it. On September 23rd, they drove it to Camp Holabird and literally drove it through the gates of Camp Holabird at 4:30 p.m. and half an hour before the actual deadline. They had to do it in 49 days. So after Bantam's prototype passed testing, the Army needed to figure out what they wanted to do. And I would love to say they had a complete plan in place of what they were going to do. That would not be true. So what they decided through a whole bunch of sausage making in October, November, and early December 1940 is, first they were going to give a contract for 500
Nope,
to
sorry, I got
Bantam.
ahead of myself.
That's okay. That's good. And they're going to give a contract to 500 more to Bantam. Well, Willys and Ford objected to that. So then they decided through a whole bunch of more machinations, we're going to give a contract for 500 to all three to build 500 more of their particular models. Well, the infantry and others in the adjutant general disagreed with that and said, no, you can't give a contract to Ford and Willys because they don't have an approved prototype. That was an absolute rock solid, could not be violated rule that the quartermaster had, is you can't get a contract unless you have a valid approved prototype, except when they're going to break it here shortly. So then the AG says, no, they don't have an approved prototype, so we're going to give 1,500 to Bantam. Well, Willys and Ford fight that, and it goes up to the deputy chief of staff of the Army, I believe, at the time, and he says, you know what, even though Ford and Willys don't have an approved prototype, we're going to give them a contract for 1,500 too. Thanks for coming. And I have that all documented in the book, all the drama, the back and forth, the memos, the bureaucratic infighting, but you end up with each vendor is going to build 1,500 more of their prototypes. They're going to take into the next version, which they call the experimental models. Bantam would take all the feedback they're getting from the Army in terms of what they need to improve and before they build their 1,500. And I'll just jump into this one last piece of before the 1,500 gets in. The quad was so overweight, and the Ford Pygmy passed testing. They said, Ford, go build 1,500. Bantam starting to build their 1,500. And as Leslie pointed out, the Bantam was finishing up a contract for 70. That's where you get grants from. And then they had the contract for 1,500 more besides the contract for 70. Long story short, the quad failed testing. In late January 1941, the quartermaster says, you need to make this vehicle weigh less. You have failed testing. You're not getting contract.
And remind us, the quad was Ford's?
Was Willis's.
Was Willys.
Willis's quad. So they failed because it was overweight, and the quartermaster wrote a memo, which I actually put in the book, and said, you need to change the engine. The engine is too heavy. That was the engine that Delmar Roos insisted upon that they have. Well, enter in a whole bunch of more machinations that gets up to the very top of the Army, and the deputy chief of staff says, oh, I know what it was, forgot one part. The second in command of the quartermaster, now it's the quartermaster's technical committee said, Willis is done. So this is the second time Willis is done in this procurement. They lost the first contract, now they're out again. The second in command of the quartermaster writes a memo overruling his own technical committee and says, you need to approve the Willis quad. It goes all the way up the chain of command, long story short, and the deputy chief of staff says, you know what? Yeah, the quad's approved. We're good. Didn't change a thing, didn't test it anymore, just said it's approved, go build 1,500. Good to have pull.
So bring us to the winner. How is the winner chosen and when?
All right, so what happened next, and we'll go through some of the slides that you have there. This is an amazing thing. Delmar Roos goes back, and the Willis team goes to work, and they create a Jeep, keeping their engine, and they must have had some real arguments on that. And they got it down to the weight. The Army decided in February of 41, 2,160 pounds is going to be the weight. Willis got their vehicle underneath it. They were able to engineer it, and they came up with what they called the Willys MA because it had changed so much from the quad. The M stood for military. The A stood for the first version. And I think, Glenn, you have a picture of the MA?
Yeah.
That is
that's the MB.
That's the MB. All right, we'll get there.
There's the MA.
There's the MA. And as I understand it, there's only 30 of them left. On the far right is me standing next to one of the 30 Willis MAs left. It's in a museum in Huntsville, Alabama, the Veterans War Memorial Museum. Earlier in that row, that museum has the Ford Pygmy. It's the oldest Jeep, surviving Jeep, the one we talked about. Ford sold it in the early 80s for, I have no idea, and this place bought it. And they have, literally, I stood next to the Ford Pygmy back in August. So there's the MA. That's the experimental model, the 1,500 they're going to build. And like I said, there's only 30 of those left that I know of, at least that's what I've heard. Ford goes back, they refine their vehicle, and they call it the Ford GP. And so that's them. And Bantam has the BRC 40. So they start a whole testing process started in December 1940. It went through all of 1941 to test these experimental models. That's the quad. See what else we have. That's the BRC #1 being tested at Camp Holderberg. So we got some nice photos of that. That's the very first one. There it is, stuck in the mud. What an amazing vehicle. This, coming from nowhere, or what this thing could do. The Army was just blown away what they were able to receive. So you have Bantam, Ford, and Willis competing with their GP, the BRC 40, and the Willis MA. And to get to the final phases of the procurement, the Army in late June decided to finalize the spec for the Jeep. And they had a standard spec, and they said, we are now going to go out for a bid for 16,000 Jeeps. So in a year, from July 1940 to July 1940, they'd gone from we need 70 to we need 16,000 Jeeps. So Willis, Bantam, Ford put in a bid. The quartermaster looks at it and says, well, you know what? They wrote a 4-page memo, which I found the memo, of justifying their decision of who was going to get the original 16,000. As I told Glenn before, the short version is Bantam and Willis are horrible and Ford walks on water. Therefore, Ford is going to get the contract for 16,000. Now, to tie it back in, the quartermaster sends that up the chain of command to William Knudsen, who I mentioned earlier about he was involved with this War Production Board, and they've been following this whole Jeep procurement for months. And he gets that award to Ford, and he says, now he had worked for Henry Ford and gone from Ford to GM. Now, I don't know if he really loved Henry Ford or not, but he says, I don't know if they'd make this decision now. Willis has an acceptable vehicle at the lowest price. Willis should get this contract. So that was the third time that Willis was almost out of the Jeep procurement. The quartermaster gets those orders. They write a memo back up, which is an amazing historic memo awarding the contract to Willis. That's how Willis got the 16,000 contract. They actually weren't awarded it at first. they went back and had to do a whole bunch of more engineering. Because of all the changes that they made from the MA to the next version, they decided to call it, because it's very complicated, the MB. And that was the vehicle for the war. So that's how, again, more drama right up to the end. Willys is out. We're building, Ford's building vehicles. We're going to award the 16,000 to Ford, da-da-da-da-da. So if you'd like, Glenn, I can wrap up the story, and then you can have other people jump in.
Yeah, we'd like to get to some Q&A.
Yeah, so get some Q&A. Last part of the story is, well, how did Ford get back into production? Well, Willys is building the MBs in August, September 1940, and early October 1940, the Army goes to, I call this the Godfather offer. They call up Willys and go, we may need a few more of these, and, what would it take for someone to build your vehicle on their license? So Willys writes a letter, which I put in the book. I found the letter. Here's what we need to do to have someone build our vehicle under license. The Army gets that, the quartermaster, because they wanted Ford so bad. 3 weeks later, they awarded a contract under the terms that Willys said for 15,000 more Jeeps to Ford. Thank you very much. And why I end in January 1942, it took them to January 1942 to finalize that contract with Ford. And Ford called their vehicle for the war the GP, which we talked about. That's how they named their things. The GPW for, GP Willys. And they had to be completely standardized. So Ford's GPW is basically a carbon copy of the MB, just being built by Ford. And that, I'm done. People had to listen a long time. So let's get some other voices in here before,
And then in total, I think Chris mentioned it earlier, how many Jeeps were built during the war by both companies?
Chris was absolutely spot on correct. I think it was about 360,000 Willys MBs and about 270,000 Ford GPWs. And I think he also said, yeah, they were everywhere. I actually have a picture in the book of a Jeep dragging a plane on an aircraft carrier. They were everywhere. So if I have the name right, Chris, I apologize if I don't. He was absolutely correct on everything that he said.
Perfect. There's the story of the development of the Jeep. And then there's one last point. Bantam, I guess, survives the war, but not much after. Is that right?
Yeah, Leslie nailed it. They were given, what happened was they were frozen out when the contract went to Ford, and they got the consolation prize exactly as Leslie described it. You could build trailers that are going to be pulled by the vehicle that you actually initially
developed.
Go ahead, Leslie. Jump in and finish that story up.
Yeah, I mean, you get the trailer, and I was looking in the background, I'm trying to remember who we borrowed that from. It's someone in the area, but they went ahead and built trailers, but they did not survive. I have to say, I don't recall the actual date, but they didn't survive much longer than that. I mean, do you remember? They might have even been defunct before the war was really over.
Yeah, they built the trailers, as I understand it. Hopefully my information is accurate. Exactly, Leslie, it didn't last much after the war. The Bantam was gone by about 1956. Kaput. And they never built vehicles after 1940. I'm not sure what they did after the war for those 9 years or so.
I'm not sure. I mean, it could have been some other, like so many other companies, they might have just found other small contracts. I mean, Heinz is doing glider wings. There are other things they might have found, but as a vehicle maker, they were done.
Yeah. Someone put in the chat, I just happened to catch it, that they built trailers after the war. So they might have just continued on with that. That I wasn't sure on. So I appreciate that piece of information.
So let's open this up to our members to ask questions, make comments. Sean, I haven't followed the chat real close. Are there questions that we should answer from the chat?
No questions I can see unless I'm missing one, but a lot of people talking about the Jeeps they had or their family owned. But yes, Pete Sarmiento and anybody else who would like to share a story of a Jeep in the family or talk about the comment they put in, just go ahead and raise your hand and we'll unmute you.
There, you're unmuted, Pete.
Yeah, I grew up in the Philippines, and my dad was an officer in 1945 when the Philippines was liberated, and I had a chance to ride on his Jeep. He was a company commander, Philippine Scout, and I was 12 years old. It was an experience that we drove from Manila to Bataan, which is about probably about 60 miles drive, rough, But that Jeep was something else. It was not only experience of riding on a Jeep as a young man, but Dad was really learning how to drive the thing because it's stick shift. And up to the liberation, of course, a lot of the Jeeps wind up in the to be jitneys. I don't know whether you know what the jitneys is. They converted into like a little mini bus. And some of the Jeeps that would belong to the military disappear, and they all wind up in a black market, and some of them has been stripped and made a jitneys out of it. So it's a lot of things going on during just about the end of World War II to the liberation to the Republic of the Philippines in '46.
And like all, I think virtually all the U.S. military vehicles, when the war was over, they were just left in place. So there's hundreds of thousands of these Jeeps left in Europe, the Philippines, throughout Asia. They become part of the culture almost of those countries. Thank you, Pete. Someone else, I think Archer. Let's unmute Archer. There we go.
Hi.
Hi, Archer.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, it's Michael Archer. So I believe just going back in time a bit, in the 1930s, Bantam was building an Austin saloon car. And this was sort of the preempt to the Jeep Bantam made, because the army looked at it and but felt it was not rugged enough for them. So they started to take bits of it off and to formulate the actual first prototype of the Jeep from that British Austin car. Yeah. I've looked into this, and basically that was what they started with as a prototype vehicle for the putting it, going towards the 1940s bid that they had with the army and everything. So yeah, I've got even a picture here of it. I don't know if I can share anything.
We'd have to have you give you the.
Got you covered if you're able to do it.
Okay, so try this. Where's it gone? Yeah, here.
You have to share your screen.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Here we are. Here. So this is the typical Austin saloon car, 1930s. And then this is what you've probably seen in your discussions today, the rare photo of the Jeep prototype.
Paul, are you familiar with that?
Rounded hood. Sorry.
No, I'm asking Paul Bruno. Paul, are you familiar with
Absolutely. I did a lot of research on Bantam. I found a book called Whatever Happened to the Baby Austin that was written in the mid-'60s. And Archer's information is absolutely correct. We didn't talk about Bantam's history, but it actually started with a guy named Herbert Austin, and I go through this in chapter 2, who had created the Austin 7 in Europe, exactly what Archer is showing there. And he wanted to bring his small cars to America. And he found a vacant car plant in Butler, Pennsylvania. He started American Austin. They were bankrupt by 1933. In 1935, the aforementioned Roy Evans purchased all of American Austin's assets, brought out the line of cars, which included the American Bantam Roadster, which is a direct descendant of that Austin saloon. And yes, English lineage is in the Jeep because Bantam's lineage was from American Austin. And I detail that all in chapter 2 of the book, including some pictures of an Austin 7, an American Austin Roadster, so on and so forth. So yeah, that's a little known part of the story. So Archer, continue. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but hopefully does my match what you have?
Yeah, that's very much what I found as well. Thank you for endorsing that. Thank you.
Archer, if you could take down your share, thank you. So Archer, you sound a bit like you have an English accent.
You should know me. I'm from Britsburg.
Oh, okay, of course. I'm sorry. I wasn't matching the face and the name.
It's okay. That's no
Yeah,
problem. No
yeah. But
problem.
that's fascinating that I'm an Anglophile, and now I can say, wow, the Jeep has some English heritage in it,
Yeah.
Archer, which would never have guessed.
It's
Okay.
interesting. It dovetails the history of the LST too, which was a joint. It was certainly English in its background. The idea came from Britain, came from overseas.
Hey, originally our country came from Britain, so
There
there's
you
a lot
go.
of connections there. Chris Perilla.
Yeah, two stories I have for you. I do docent down at the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall, and whenever I do the World War II section of the hall in a tour, we come across the Jeep on exhibit there, but it is a 1953 Korean War vintage, and you can see how substantial that metalworking and the weight of that Jeep is compared to these earlier versions of the Jeep. I make sure that tell the story of Bantam, but I make sure I qualify that this is not an original Bantam. This is not World War II Jeep, but this is the version, and it's the one that's most familiar from the series MASH, where they're taking the soldiers down from the helicopter.
Yeah.
But there is quite a difference, which you would expect in the evolution of the design over that 8-year period or more. But my father had a Willys, and it was that wonderful popular red color with ragtop, and he loved operating that, and we loved running around in it as children. But when he was tired of it and it's time to get rid of it, he converted it into a snow cone wagon, and
Yeah.
he sold it, and he and the back end there, and he outfitted it with a cab and all the stuff that a young man needed, wanted to go into business to do snow cones. So that's what he turned it into before he sold it. But we had the traditional red Willys back in 1960, 61, 62. So that was
Yeah,
fun.
I have to say, I grew up in a Willys Jeep. I was telling Paul this. My father, who was, retired enlisted man, became a gas station owner and a repair shop mechanic. And he had bought a Willys Jeep out of his love for Jeeps. We put a hard top on it and a snowplow in front of it. And from the time I was 14, 15 years old, that's how I learned how to drive a stick shift in that Willys Jeep. And we plowed all kinds of lots, all over Washington, Pennsylvania. That was back when it used to snow in the winter. So, Sean, anything else that we should?
Yeah, there's a couple questions now in the chat. Todd mentioned that the Jeep's axle was a key engineering accomplishment. What made it so special?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was looking at the chat. I can answer a few of these questions if we have the time. What made it so special was 4x4 was very new at that time. And the requirements for the Jeep, there wasn't an axle that was actually in production or existed that would meet the requirements that the Army wanted. So Spicer was the only manufacturer of axles that could build or create this part. And they had to go back, and again, Fred Hall and Robert Lewis detailed what they did. They had to modify a Studebaker axle and do a whole bunch of engineering on that particular axle in August and mid-September to be able to create it so it would fit what Bantam was building. Then they got the order from Willys because they got the side deal to build the quad. And because the Willys was using a different engine, they had to modify the axle that they had created for Bantam somewhat so it would fit into the Willys quad. And there's testimony and actually memos where when they wanted the 1500, they literally had to go to Spicer first and say, can you manufacture this many axles, which ended up being 4,500 for these Jeeps, because it was the key part and they were the only ones that could make it. But they had to do some significant engineering on a Studebaker axle to create what was needed in terms of that. If anyone else knows a little more of that, feel free. But again, Fred Hall and Robert Lewis' testimony really goes into detail of what they did.
And then, Sean, Greg Yost had a couple of questions.
Great. And we'll get to that. Just one second, Greg. One more. Why did Bantam not get the contract to build the first 16,000 vehicles, and how did they end up under Chrysler?
Okay, well, they didn't get the contract for 16,000, basically because the short version is the quartermaster didn't really feel they had the production, and they were bankrupt, and they were small, and they were really, I hate to use the word bias, but for lack of a better term, toward Willys and Ford. So when they put in, they were really, as 1941 was going on, March, April, May, you could see them being kind of pushed out. And when the 16,000 came, the quartermaster basically said, they don't have the production capability. They missed some deadlines, and we just don't want to go with them. So that's really why they didn't get the contract for the 16,000. They had a good Jeep. Willys had the best one, but that's my knowledge of it. In fact, the memo that I talked about is in the book, and they say Bantam, doesn't do this, et cetera, and so forth. And that's why we're ruling them out for the 16,000. How it ended up at Chrysler, that is a great story. I call it the Jeep curse. Others may have called it the Jeep curse. Every 10 years, almost since 1945, the Jeep brand has been bought or sold to another company. It went from Willys to Kaiser to American Motors Corporation, if everybody remembers those. I think American Motors sold it to Chrysler. Chrysler got bought out by Mercedes. They went bankrupt. They became Cerebus Capital Management, if everybody remembers that from 20 years ago. Gets bought out by Fiat. Fiat gets changed into Stellantis, and right about now they should be sold again. So we'll see. But that's how they ended up under Chrysler. A number of different sales of the Jeep over decades. And on that, when Kaiser bought the Jeep, they still called it the Willys Jeep. In 1963, they decided to call it the Kaiser Jeep, and the Willys name went into history in 1963.
There's been someone active in the chat, Brian's Military Jeeps. Can we recognize him? I'm not sure. Here it is. I see him now.
Ask him to unmute. Brian, if you're there. While we wait for Brian, Greg, you are unmuted.
Yes, thank you so much. This is a great program. We hear so much about the battles and the people overseas and everything. This is the classic story of the home front and all that went on. I mean, just everything that we read about the home front and everything. This is the real story. Thank you so much for this very good story. I had two quick questions. From my understanding, one is that certainly in a military situation or on duty or whatever term you want to use, the Jeep did not need a key. It was just, you just got in the Jeep and rode away because you're in a combat situation and you can't find the keys. That isn't going to help. So wanted to ask you about that. And secondly, turning on the headlights. You couldn't accidentally turn on the headlights, that you actually had to flip two different switches so that your knee didn't hit it or something when you hit a bump and you're in the middle of the night and you just turn on the headlights and the enemy sees you. So comment on those if you could. Thank you so much for the program.
Oh, yeah, I'll do the best I can. On the headlights, I don't remember off the top of my head, but I do remember a gentleman by the name of Duncan Rolls recreated the Bantam BRC-1, and I have a chapter on that in my first book, and it had an electric start. I remember that. So, Greg, I think if I have the name right, you're correct on that you didn't have keys, and that really surprised me. I'm like, they have an electric start in 1940, but looks like they did. If anyone else on the call has any more on that, I'll kick it over to Glenn to see if he wants to have him help, because I'm not I write about them. I'm not necessarily the most mechanically inclined guy.
Rick Weber.
I don't think anything else to add there.
Rick?
Well, I know, I'm not going to say I stole a Jeep, but we borrowed a Jeep from the Marines. And my captain told me to do it, and there was no keys. But just keep your Jeep. You had to take a chain and chain it off, and then you had a key lock. Other than that, you could steal any Jeep you wanted. That was, I don't know what year or whatever. I know this was 1970, but I don't know what year the Jeep was. But you could just you could take any Jeep you wanted.
Well, in fact, Rick, let me go back to this slide presentation because I knew there'd be so many Vietnam vets on, I wanted to share with you a little bit that I found of what happened to the Jeep during the Vietnam War as it evolved. Chris mentioned the Korean War, but by 1960, oh geez, I'm going to forget the date, somewhere in the mid 60s, the Vietnam era Jeep was called the Ford M151. Military utility something or other. I forgot what it is already. And there's a picture of it. And then I'm sure a lot of you guys will recognize this picture. Here's a column of Jeeps coming down a dirt road. And the other thing in Vietnam, which happened, I think, in World War II, but more so in Vietnam, I read an article. I think there were like 16 or 17 different varieties of Jeeps, right? Jeeps, just plain open Jeeps, Jeeps with machine guns on them, Jeeps with other kind of weapons on them. It was even turned into a small ambulance at times. So you Vietnam era guys, you must have seen tens of thousands of Jeeps in Nam. And then, just to finish the story and to go all the way through to the current day and get up to Colonel Washbaw's days, right? The Jeep was phased out in the 80s, and in 1989, the Humvee comes out. Brad, I'm going to guess you've been in one of these many, many times. Let's unmute Brad, if we could.
Sure, I had experience with the M151 too in the early 80s before the Humvee came in. So both of them, I think, Humvee's larger and whatnot, but yeah, I've spent many hours in the Humvee and sleeping, trying to sleep, trying to eat, trying to communicate. But it's interesting, the evolution of the vehicles for the military. And I guess today there's another evolution coming for a vehicle. I don't have a picture of it, but I've been reading some about it. So the evolution continues.
Interesting. So you were there for the transition from the sort of what originally thought the M151 to the Humvee. That must have been. What was your thoughts when you first saw the first Humvee compared to the Jeep you've been riding?
It seemed big, and it seemed of course heavier. It seemed all the different variants that came out. It made it interesting. But the other M151 was the company Gunny's really tool with the trailer to deliver supplies and whatnot. It was quite versatile, and it handled the terrain very well. And it could get transported a lot easier than the Humvee, so it had its advantages.
Yeah. Okay. See, Justin Miller has his hand up. Sean, did we? Yeah, he's unmuted. Justin.
And Sean, yeah, didn't we go? We went. There was a transition before the Humvee. It was called the Gamma Goat. I think it's the M561.
Yeah, the Gamma Goat was around with the Jeep, and it was a very I think a high-pitched, you could hear it coming. It was really a loud.
Right. It worked half the time because that center axle, more wires that I was associated with were locked in place because the articulation between the two pieces was hard on it.
Yeah, it didn't last too long, but you could hear it coming. That was for sure.
That was true. Anyway,
Brian,
one of those other things that we had in the Army.
Brian's Military Jeeps, we do have you unmuted now. We get a little bit of feedback, but go ahead and talk.
Okay, this is a test. Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Oh, thank goodness. Yes, hi everybody. I've had a long history with Jeeps since I was 16, and I went for a ride in a friend's Jeep at 16, and it was his brother's 47 CJ2A, and that started me on a journey. I fell in love that day with them, and I think I've owned about 50 of them at last count. I went into the World War II Jeep business, in fact, about 1986, and I sent a link up earlier about what my collection of my cool Jeeps were. And I just had a question. In the research that you did on the procurement, one of the rarest ones they came up with was a prototype Ford GP. It was the second series, not the first series of 1500. It was the second series of 1500, and it had the four-wheel steering, of which the procurement manuals that I've got and the owner's manuals I've got from that came with them back in the day. Only 50 of them were made. I believe there's like 3 surviving of those. And I wonder if you, but there's so little information about them. I'm wondering if you found any of that in your research.
The only thing I did find is they asked Bantam to build a four-wheel steer, and I think I have a picture of that in at least 2 of the books, and that they wanted four-wheel steer from the other vendors, and they only built, exactly as you said. Hopefully, Brian is your first name. I'm going with Brian's military. And so I think your information is more accurate than mine in terms of the four-wheel steers. I didn't focus on them that much, but they were definitely created. And so what you're adding is definitely value add in terms of the story, that they not only had to do the original prototypes, two-wheel steer, if I got the term right, but also that technological innovation before wheel steer.
Yeah, that was the generic way of referring to them. Was the standard Jeep would be a two-wheel steer. Then it was a special version with four-wheel steering. They thought that it would be great to have a tighter turning radius, and within short order, it came out that they were prone to rolling over, and so most this is nothing that we've got from, at least that I've seen in actual printed evidence. More along the lines of other Jeep people that are into the prototype Jeeps, like I was, and they did some of the more researches. I was just a starving college student at the time, so I didn't have the money to travel to the various places. I was out in California. But in any event, that most of those of the 50 four-wheel steerings were converted back. They thought it was a bad idea, and mine was converted back to two-wheel steering. So it had linkage on that axle, and it had special body panels that had been put in where they had cut out and made cuts in the rear fender well, because when you turn the wheel, the rear wheel, it would have rubbed. So they made these cutouts that were then welded in at the factory. And there's a bunch of other things that were germane only to those 50 four-wheel steering. And that's what my Jeep had, was those modifications. But when I got it, it was a two-wheel steering Jeep. So it had a standard GP rear axle and a standard front axle. So unfortunately, and you just can't find those parts. In 30 years of looking, I've never found any of the parts.
Brian, where are you located?
I was in Southern California for all those years. I'm currently out in Justin, Texas, which is DFW. And as a kid, I had 2 loves. One was ghost towns and the Gold Rush, California, Colorado. And the reason I got into Jeeps was because I wanted to go to ghost towns and explore the mine shafts and like. And everybody always said, "Oh my gosh, you got to get a Jeep." Jeep.
Oh, we lost your audio, Brian.
Well, we've had Chris waiting for a bit while we ask Chris to speak.
It's funny how history repeats itself, because it was Willys who turned the Jeep after World War II into an SUV, or the precursor of the SUV, a utility vehicle for farmers, or just an ordinary utility vehicle. Then comes the Humvee, and we have Desert Storm, and everybody sees this Humvee in action. And if I recall the story correctly, it was actor Arnold Schwarzenegger who pushed for a civilian Humvee. He wanted to own one so badly. And so General Motors went to the military and said, can we issue a civilian version? And they actually engineered a civilian version. And I think in that first 10 years they were on the market, they ranged from $65,000 to $95,000, depending on how you customized it. But now that's integrated into our automotive history as well, just like the Jeep, and now the Humvee just comes out of an interesting demand or interest in the vehicle, and it's transferred into civilian use. So I just thought it was interesting how history repeated itself with those 2 vehicles.
I had a friend back in the late 90s. I don't know. He had a Humvee, one of the civilian Humvees. And the problem was, he said every time he drove by a gas station, he had to stop. It just drank gas.
Came with a big price.
Yes. Okay. Well, Sean, anything else that we should cover here? We're down to the last, well, it is the witching hour. It is 8:30.
No, I think we're good. Al did ask, was the Jeep improved over the many years as a military vehicle? If so, how and what and when did it get the modifications?
I can speak to that for the war. In the court case, yes, it was approved throughout the war. They made 250 to 300 changes. And in the court case, when they were in Toledo, one of the engineers created a testimony from their records of the 40 most important changes to the MB during the war up to 1944, and I included them in the book. So they're right there. I couldn't believe it. I'm reading it. Go, we made this change. Not only what the change was, why they did it, and what production number they put the change in. So after World War II, I can't speak to. I would think it would, but it was definitely continuously modified during the war, and I got some evidence of that in the book.
And clearly, it's evolved over the decades. Up as a military vehicle up to the point it was abandoned. Ben Wright wants us to remember, Sean, Monday night's 250-year celebration. Why don't you remind everybody of that, Sean?
This coming Monday, we will go ahead.
I think that's what he's referring to.
Don't forget to announce the 250-year celebration on Monday evening. That, I assume, will be a historic evening. I believe we're going to be talking with Josh Cannon, a Marine, that night. He wrote a book about Odysseus, which is also on the cover of our BBC magazine. But otherwise, yes. Thank you, Ben, for the. Do you mean Marine Corps? Do you mean Marine Corps history? Ah, that's what he meant. Okay, the 250th birthday of the Marine Corps. So, happy birthday, Brad. Sorry, yes. Monday night, we will have Marine Josh Cannon on. So we'll be celebrating and talking about not only Marine Corps birthday, but talking with him about his book. So we'll be looking for everyone to join us on Monday night.
Okay. And then next Thursday night, another Greatest Generation Live program with a Kevin McCallum, veteran who wrote a book about brothers who died in World War II together and are buried in the same World War II cemeteries overseas. Brothers in Arms, it's called. Sober book to read, but some incredibly courageous stories. So that's next Thursday night. And I think we're done, Sean. Are we done?
Yeah, that was a great, tons of information tonight. And thanks, everybody. We saw a lot of new faces. And Brian, Pete, thanks for being here with us. Leslie, thank you. Paul, great information. Glenn, great show as always.
Yep. Thank you, Paul, very, very much. I learned more about Jeeps in the last 10 days than I ever thought I knew.
Thanks for having me on. It was
been fascinating. The story of the Jeep. Leslie, as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Oh, you're welcome. This was a great program. Great discussion.
Makes me want to go right back down to the Heinz History Center and walk around that Jeep. Take care.